Hey Geek, so some interesting news today. Actually, it's about Microsoft, and it's actually about Bill Gates and how he is using an Android phone. Now, if you would have told me this about 5 years ago, I would have been really surprised. But Microsoft has been making a lot of moves in other platforms, specifically open source. So this story came about when Bill Gates was in an interview, and he said that he was using an Android phone with a lot of Microsoft services. Now, he didn't mention which Android phone, but more than likely it's the Samsung Galaxy S8, and they actually sell that in the Microsoft stores along with a lot of Windows applications. Now, the reason why this isn't surprising to me is because Microsoft was already using Android to begin with. So if you recall, a few years ago, Microsoft actually bought Nokia, mainly for a lot of their patents and their phone service. And as you know, Nokia actually makes a lot of Android phones. And it was really, in my opinion, Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, who's moving in these directions. So Nadella, unlike Steve Ballmer, he really takes a much longer, broader approach than just purely just Windows, 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 and Microsoft all the time. Because Nadella noticed where Microsoft weaknesses were, and then he focused on their strengths. For example, in the mobile space, Windows Phone was not doing well at all. So instead of focusing all their resources and money into a platform that just wasn't working, instead he decided to refocus their attention on producing Microsoft apps for Android phones and Apple devices. And so this was a better strategy. And also in the server side, instead of fighting Linux, produce services for Linux. So in this case, for the open source community, Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation. Then they were offered some Linux services on their Azure cloud services, and they offered the Linux subsystem within Windows itself with Bash. And so Microsoft has been making a lot of moves, and it really is a really smart strategy. Because quite often in the news we hear mainly things about Google, Apple, Android, iOS, but you don't really hear about Microsoft all too much. Even though the majority of news is negative for Microsoft, they're actually making tons of money, and they're using a strategy very similar to what they did against Apple in the early 80s. So instead of trying to compete one-on-one vertically, they took the approach of being wide, offering their services on as many platforms as possible. And back in the early days of Microsoft and Apple, you remember that Microsoft Windows was actually on way more machines like IBM PCs versus Apple. And they are following a similar strategy here against both Google and Apple. And so while Google and Apple are fighting each other, Microsoft's making moves. So with all of that, Bill Gates using an Android phone is not that surprising at all. But what is surprising is how many Windows apps are on Android and iOS. So in a way, you can say that Windows Phone is successful because the whole point of it was to get people into Microsoft's ecosystem. And with so many Microsoft products and services on so many platforms, it's not hard to see that maybe the actual winner is the one that you didn't expect coming.